At 6:03 a.m., Margaret Whitfield stood on her neighbor's doorstep with a professional-grade noise meter, her arthritis-gnarled fingers gripping the device like a weapon. The digital display glowed red, 47 decibels, 7 decibels over the city's noise ordinance. After 43 years as a retired municipal code enforcement officer, she knew exactly what came next. What she didn't know was that her crusade against the Hendersons' pool filter would uncover a secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her quiet suburban street and cost her far more than she could ever imagine. Began on a Tuesday morning in late June when Margaret Whitfield's perfectly orchestrated routine shattered like glass against concrete. For 17 years, Margaret had started each day at 5:47 a.m. with Earl Grey tea on her back patio, watching the sunrise paint her meticulously maintained garden in shades of gold. The ritual was sacred 13 minutes of solitude before the world intruded with its chaos and noise. But that Tuesday, as she settled into her cushioned wicker chair with her bone china cup, a low mechanical hum violated the morning silence. The sound crawled under her skin like fingernails on a chalkboard. She set down her tea with trembling hands and listened, her jaw clenching tighter with each passing second. The noise was coming from next door, from the Hendersons' backyard. "Those people?" she muttered, the words bitter as burnt coffee. Margaret had lived at 1247 Maple Grove Lane since 1987, long before the neighborhood transformed from modest, middle-class homes to the sprawling renovations that now dominated the street. She'd watched families come and go, maintained the unofficial role of neighborhood watchdog, and prided herself on keeping the peace. The Hendersons had moved in 6 months ago. Jake Henderson, some hotshot tech executive in his 30s, and his wife Sarah, a yoga instructor with an irritating habit of greeting everyone with aggressive enthusiasm. They'd gut-renovated the house, expanding it into a modern monstrosity that loomed over Margaret's modest ranch-style home like a concrete bully. And now they'd installed a pool. Margaret stood and walked to the chain-link fence that separated their properties. Through the gaps, she could see the source of her torment, a large, industrial-looking pool filter humming away beside their pristine swimming pool. She checked her watch. 5:52 a.m., 5 minutes into her sacred morning ritual, and these inconsiderate newcomers had already ruined it. By 7:30 a.m., Margaret had researched the city's noise ordinances online. By 8:15 a.m., she'd measured the distance between the filter and her property line. 14 feet well within the 40-foot buffer zone required for mechanical equipment. By 9 a.m., she'd called the city's code enforcement office, Maple Grove Lane noise complaint, she told the bored-sounding clerk. Mechanical equipment violating residential noise standards. "I need an inspector out here today," but city bureaucracy moved like molasses in winter. The earliest appointment was Thursday afternoon. Margaret hung up, her frustration crystallizing into something harder, more determined. She'd spent 4 decades enforcing municipal codes before retiring. She knew the system inside and out, and she refused to let some entitled millennials think they could steamroll the rules just because they had money. At 10:17 a.m., she marched to the Hendersons' front door. Jake Henderson answered on the second knock, wearing board shorts and a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair still damp from what Margaret assumed was an early morning swim in his noise-polluting pool. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his smile faltering when he saw her expression. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Your pool filter," Margaret said, without preamble. "It's disturbing the peace. I need you to move it or install sound dampening immediately." Jake blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, what? The filter? It's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The noise carries directly into my backyard. I've checked the city ordinance's mechanical equipment must maintain noise levels below 40 decibels between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., and no more than 55 decibels during daytime hours." Okay, Jake said slowly. "I didn't realize it was bothering anyone. Let me talk to Sarah and see what we can do." "You have 48 hours, Margaret said. "After that, I'm filing a formal complaint with code enforcement." She turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing in his doorway with his mouth slightly open. But by Thursday morning, nothing had changed. The filter continued its relentless humming, destroying Margaret's morning ritual and keeping her awake. At night, the sound seemed to grow louder each day, boring into her skull like an audio parasite. When the code enforcement inspector arrived Thursday afternoon, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Dave Carmichael Margaret was ready. "I've documented everything," she told him, leading him to her backyard. "Times, dates, decibel readings. That filter runs constantly, and it's 7 feet closer to the property line than regulations allow." Dave pulled out his own noise meter and took several readings. Margaret watched his face carefully, looking for validation. "It's registering 42 decibels, he said finally. "That's within acceptable limits for daytime hours." "What about nighttime?" Margaret pressed. "It runs all night long." "Pool filters typically do," Dave said with a shrug. "But I'll take an evening reading if you want to file a formal complaint." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "I want to file the complaint today." That evening, Dave returned and took more readings. The filter registered 38 decibels at 9 p.m., well within the nighttime limit. But Margaret knew the machine was louder in the early morning hours when the air was still and sound carried farther. "I'll need to come back tomorrow morning," Dave said early, around 6 a.m. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "I'll be waiting," but Friday morning brought disappointment. At 6 a.m. sharp, Dave's meter read 41 decibels, 1 decibel over the limit, but within the margin of error. For the equipment, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitfield," Dave said, packing up his gear. "It's borderline, but not enough for a violation." "This is unacceptable," Margaret said, her voice rising. "I know what I'm hearing. That filter is destroying my quality of life. Have you tried talking to your neighbors again?" "Sometimes people are willing to work with you if you approach them nicely." Margaret's face flushed red. "I shouldn't have to approach them nicely." That afternoon, she drove to the city hall and filed a formal complaint anyway, demanding a second opinion. The clerk, the same board woman from the phone, accepted her paperwork with obvious reluctance. "We'll send another inspector when one becomes available," she said. "Could be a few weeks." A few weeks. Margaret's hands shook as she walked back to her car. These people thought they could wear her down, make her give up. They didn't understand who they were dealing with. That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, laptop open, researching noise measurement equipment. If the city wouldn't do its job properly, she'd do it herself. She found what she needed: a professional-grade digital noise meter, calibrated to municipal standards, available for overnight delivery. It cost her $847 more than she'd spent on anything non-essential in years. But as she clicked purchase, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: control. The package arrived Saturday morning. Margaret spent the weekend learning to operate the device, taking dozens of readings around her property at different times of day. She documented everything in a leather-bound notebook, creating charts and graphs that would make any code enforcement officer proud. Monday morning at 5:47 a.m., Margaret positioned herself at the fence line with her new equipment. The filter's hum seemed especially loud in the pre-dawn stillness. She held up the meter: 47 decibels, 7 decibels over the nighttime limit. "Got you," she whispered. But as she stood there, savoring her victory, she noticed something else. Jake Henderson's home office light was on, and through the window, she could see him hunched over his computer, typing furiously. It was barely 6 a.m., and he was already working. Margaret frowned. In 6 months of living next door, she'd never seen Jake up this early. She'd assumed he was one of those lazy tech types who rolled out of bed at noon. But here he was, apparently starting his day even earlier than she did. A thought crept into her mind, an uncomfortable possibility she quickly pushed away. She had her evidence. That was all that mattered. At 6:03 a.m., Margaret walked to the Hendersons' front door and rang the bell. She could hear movement inside, then footsteps approaching. Jake opened the door, looking harried and slightly panicked, still in yesterday's clothes. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice hoarse, It's 6 in the morning." "Your pool filter," Margaret said, holding up the noise meter. 47 decibels. 7 decibels over the legal limit. "I have it documented." Jake stared at the device, then at her face. Something shifted in his expressional hardness. "Never seen before." "You bought a noise meter," he said slowly. "I did what I had to do. The city's equipment is clearly inadequate. You spent your own money to buy professional equipment to measure the sound of our pool filter." Margaret lifted her chin. I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to enforce the law." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more controlled. "Mrs. Whitfield, can I ask you something? Do you know what I do for work?" Margaret spent the morning pacing her living room like a caged animal, Jake's words echoing in her mind. What really happened to make Stanley Kowalski so desperate to leave this neighborhood? She hadn't thought about Stanley in months. The old man had been her neighbor for 3 decades, quiet, dependable, never caused trouble. Then suddenly last winter, he'd put his house on the market and disappeared within weeks. She'd assumed it was typical elderly behavior. Too much house, too many memories, time to move to Florida. But $50,000 under market value. That did seem strange. Margaret pulled out her laptop and began researching, her fingers flying. Across the keyboard, with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years building cases, public records, property transfers, obituaries, she knew how to dig. What she found made her stomach clench. Stanley Kowalski, age 73, had moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in a low-income senior facility across town. Not Florida, not a nice retirement community. A bare-bones place where people went when they had no other options. She kept digging. Stanley's financial records were private, but property tax assessments were public. His house had been assessed. At $347,000, he'd sold it to the Hendersons for $295,000. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Why would Stanley take such a massive loss, unless he'd been desperate to leave? "Hello, Mrs. Whitfield. This is Detective Rosa Martinez with the Financial Crimes Division. I was hoping we could talk." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "About what? I think you know. Would you prefer to meet at the station, or can I come to you? I don't understand what this is about." Stanley Kowalski filed a complaint before. He moved. "We've been investigating, and some new information has come to light. I'm in the neighborhood now. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The line went dead. Margaret's hands shook as she set down the phone. Stanley filed a complaint about what? About her. She tried to think, tried to remember. Had she done anything wrong? She'd been the unofficial neighborhood watch for years, keeping an eye on property values, reporting code violations, making sure people maintained their homes properly. That wasn't a crime. The doorbell rang exactly 10 minutes later. Detective Martinez was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a demeanor. She wasn't alone. A tall man in a suit stood behind her, holding a tablet. "Mrs. Whitfield. I'm Detective Martinez, and this is Agent Cooper from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, FBI." Margaret's knees went weak. "May we come in?" Margaret nodded. Not trusting her voice, they followed her into the living room, where Martinez pulled out a recording device. "We're investigating a pattern of financial elder abuse in this neighborhood. Mr. Kowalski's case led us to examine other property transfers in the area over the past 5 years. I don't understand what this has to do with me." Agent Cooper spoke for the first time. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you familiar with a practice called property flipping through harassment?" Margaret's mouth went dry. "It's a scheme where someone systematically harasses elderly homeowners, its complaints, code violations, frivolous lawsuits, until the stress becomes unbearable. The victims sell their homes quickly, often at below-market prices, just to escape the harassment." "That's terrible," Margaret managed. "It is," Martinez agreed, "especially when the harasser has connections to real estate investors who swoop in with cash offers." The room felt like it was spinning. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair. "Mr. Kowalski told us an interesting story," Martinez continued, "about a neighbor who filed 17 noise complaints against him in 6 months. Complained about his air conditioning unit, his garbage disposal, even his doorbell. Called code enforcement so many times they started ignoring her calls. Lots of people file complaints not like this," Agent Cooper interrupted. "We pulled the records. 63 complaints filed by you in the past 5 years, all targeting elderly residents, all resulting in those residents selling their homes within 12 months. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. That's coincidence, is it?" Martinez leaned forward. "Because we also discovered that your nephew, David Whitfield, works for Apex Property Solutions, the same company that purchased 4 of those homes, including Stanley Kowalski's." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. David, her sister's son, the one she'd helped through college, who'd gotten into real estate investment after graduation, who'd been so grateful when she'd occasionally mentioned which neighbors seemed stressed, which properties might come on the market soon. "We think you've been feeding your nephew inside information," Agent Cooper said, targeting vulnerable elderly residents with harassment campaigns, then alerting him when they're ready to sell. "That's not, I was enforcing the rules." 17 noise complaints about a 70-year-old man's air conditioner. Martinez's voice was sharp. Air conditioner that tested at 32 decibels, well below any noise ordinance. Margaret's vision blurred. She remembered Stanley Sweet, confused Stanley, who'd come to her door so many times, begging her to stop calling the city. She'd told herself she was maintaining neighborhood standards. She'd told herself she was doing the right thing. "We have phone records," Agent Cooper said quietly. "Calls between you and David, often within hours of you. Filing complaints, we have bank records showing payments from Apex Properties to an account in your name. Small amounts, but consistent. We call them finder's fees." "I never," David said, "those were gifts. Birthday money. $1,600 for your birthday." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Every few months?" Margaret closed her eyes. The money had been so helpful, just small amounts to supplement her fixed income. David had been so appreciative when she'd mentioned neighbors who seemed ready to downsize. She'd never thought of it as, "Oh God," she whispered. "Stanley." "Mr. Kowalski is diabetic," Martinez said. "The stress of constant harassment, the sleep deprivation from your late-night noise complaints, the anxiety it sent his blood sugar spiraling. He was hospitalized twice. His doctor said the psychological stress was literally killing him." Margaret doubled over, her hands pressed to her stomach. "I didn't know. I didn't realize. ... "You didn't want to realize," Agent Cooper said, "because it was profitable not to." "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "That depends," Martinez said. "We're building a case against your nephew and Apex Properties. Elder abuse, wire fraud, conspiracy. If you cooperate, testify against them, we might be able to work something out. And if I don't, then you're looking at federal charges as a co-conspirator. 5 to 10 years minimum." Margaret felt her world collapsing around her. 40 years of law enforcement, of being the good guy, of maintaining order and justice. How had she become this? "There's something else," Agent Cooper said, glancing at his tablet. "Your current neighbor, Jake Henderson, contacted us this morning. He's been conducting his own investigation into the previous homeowner's situation." Margaret's head snapped up. "Jake called you? He's very thorough. Found financial records, traced the property transfer, even tracked down Mr. Kowalski's current address. He thought we should know about the pattern of harassment you've been directing at his family, but I only just started complaining about the pool filter." 47 complaints in 6 months, Martinez said, reading from her notes. "Pool filter, landscaping violations, parking infractions, property line disputes. Your neighbors haven't even been living there a full year, and you've already filed more complaints against them than most people file in a lifetime." Margaret's face crumpled. Even now, even knowing the truth about what she'd done to Stanley and the others, she'd been doing it again. Automatically, compulsively, like a disease she couldn't control. "The difference," Agent Cooper said, "is that Jake Henderson isn't a vulnerable elderly person. He's a forensic analyst who knows how to fight back. He's going to sue me." "Isn't he?" "Probably. But that's the least of your problems right now." Martinez stood up, pocketing the recording device. "We need your answer, Mrs. Whitfield. Will you cooperate with our investigation?" Margaret looked around her living room at the certificates on the wall from her years in code enforcement, at the photos of neighborhood watch meetings, at the meticulous files she'd kept on every resident's violations. She'd thought she was protecting the neighborhood. She'd thought she was upholding the law. But all she'd done was terrorize old people for money. "Stanley," she whispered, Can I see him? Apologize." "Mr. Kowalski passed away 3 weeks ago," Martinez said softly. "Heart attack. His daughter says the stress of losing his home, having to move to that facility, ... it broke him." The words hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. Stanley was dead. Sweet, harmless Stanley, who'd only ever wanted to live quietly in his home of 30 years. Dead because of her. "I'll cooperate," she said, her voice hollow. "I'll tell you everything." As the detectives prepared to leave, Agent Cooper paused at the door. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Henderson asked me to give you a message. He says the pool filter will be moved to the far end of his property by tomorrow. Professional sound dampening installed. He doesn't want any more trouble. Margaret stared at him. He's street? Margaret spent the night writing letters she should have written years ago. By dawn, 17 envelopes sat on her kitchen table, each one addressed to a former neighbor, each one containing an apology that felt both necessary and insufficient. She'd found addresses for most of them: Mrs. Chen, who'd moved to a smaller apartment after Margaret's campaign against her excessive bird feeders; Mr. Rodriguez, who'd sold his house after she'd reported him for parking violations that didn't exist; the Patel family, who'd endured months of complaints about their cultural cooking smells, all of them elderly, all of them vulnerable, all of them now living in smaller places, lesser places, because she'd made their lives unbearable. At 7 a.m., Margaret's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw Jake Henderson standing on her porch, holding 2 cups of coffee. She opened the door, bracing herself for confrontation. "I brought you coffee," Jake said simply. "Thought you might need it." Margaret stared at him, confused. "Why would you ... after what you found out about me ... Because you're about to go through hell," Jake said, "and despite everything, you're still my neighbor." She stepped aside to let him in. He set 1 cup on her coffee table and settled into the chair across from her couch. "Detective Martinez called me this morning," he said. "Told me you agreed to cooperate." Margaret nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I owe you an apology. The pool filter complaints, the harassment." "Margaret," his voice was gentle but firm, "I know what you did. I know about the money, the scheme with your nephew, all of it. The question is, what are you going to do now?" "I'm going to testify. Help them build their case. I'm going to prison, probably. Maybe, maybe not." Jake leaned forward. "Been thinking about this all night. About Stanley. About the others. About justice versus revenge." Margaret finally looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The prosecutors want to nail Apex Properties. Your nephew's company has been running this scam across 3 counties. You're small fish compared to them. If you give them everything, phone calls, the whole operation, you might avoid prison time." "I don't deserve to avoid anything." "No, you don't," Jake agreed bluntly. "But Stanley Kowalski is dead. Prison won't bring him back. The question is whether you rotting in a cell serves justice, or whether there's something more useful you could do with whatever time you have left." Margaret felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. "What are you suggesting?" "Restitution. Real restitution. Not just testifying, but making things right." Before Margaret could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her nephew's number. "David," she said quietly. "Don't answer it," Jake said immediately. "Not without a lawyer present. Everything you say now could be used against you." Margaret stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. Within seconds, it started again. "He knows," she whispered. "Somehow, he knows the FBI is investigating." Jake's expression darkened. "Have you talked to him since yesterday?" "No, I was too ashamed." Margaret stopped mid-sentence as understanding dawned. "Oh, God, he's been monitoring my phone calls, hasn't he? That's how he always knew when I was about to file complaints. Smart. Illegal, but smart." Jake pulled out his own phone. "I'm calling Detective Martinez. If David's panicking, he might try to destroy evidence." But before Jake could dial, Margaret's front door exploded inward. David Whitfield stood in the doorway, his face red with rage, his normally immaculate suit wrinkled and stained. Behind him stood 2 other men Margaret didn't recognize, both large, both looking like they'd stepped out of a crime movie. "Aunt Margaret," David said, his voice deadly calm. "We need to talk." Jake slowly stood up, his hand still on his phone. "I think you should leave, and I think you should mind your own fucking business," David snapped. "This is a family matter." "David," language, Margaret started. "Shut up," David said, his composure cracking. "Just shut up. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know how much money is at stake here?" "I know people are dead because of what we did," Margaret said quietly. David laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "People die, Margaret. Old people especially. That's not our fault. Stanley Kowalski. Stanley Kowalski was a diabetic with heart problems who lived in a house that was too big for him. We helped him move somewhere more appropriate. We did him a favor." Jake stepped forward. "You killed him." "No, David said, pulling something from his jacket. Margaret's blood froze when she saw the gun. We provided a service. But now my dear aunt has developed a conscience, and that's going to be a problem. David, put that away, Margaret said, her voice shaking. You're not a killer, aren't I? David's eyes were wild now, desperate. Apex Properties is worth $12 million. We've got operations in 5 states. Do you think I'm going to let it all collapse because you feel bad about some old man? Jake raised his hands slowly. Let's everyone calm down here. There's no need for theirs. Every need, David interrupted. You started this, you and your forensic analysis and your righteous indignation. You should have just moved the fucking pool filter. I did move it, Jake said. Yesterday, it's been fixed. David's grip tightened on the gun. Way too late. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. After months of anxiety, of guilt eating her alive, she finally understood what she had to do. David, she said, standing up. Look at me. Sit. Down, Margaret. No, she took a step toward him. I said, look at me. Something in her voice made him focus on her face. I raised you after your father left, she said. Helped you through school. Gave you your first job reference. I loved you like my own son. Margaret and I turned you into this monster. This person who points guns at neighbors and calls dead men inconveniences. Tears ran down her cheeks. Stanley Kowalski was a good man. He deserved to die, peacefully in his own home, surrounded by his memories. Instead, he died scared and alone because of us. He was nothing, nobody. He was everything, Margaret said, her voice growing stronger. He was someone's father, someone's friend. He mattered, and we took that away from him for money. David's hand was shaking now. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The investors, the FBI investigation, the money we owe. Then end it, Margaret said. Put the gun down and end it. Don't make this worse than it already is. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the sound of David's ragged breathing. Margaret could see the internal war playing out on his face. The last remnants of the boy she'd raised fighting against the man he'd become. Then his expression hardened, and she knew she'd lost him. I'm sorry, Aunt Margaret, but you're going to have to disappear for a while, both of you. Margaret closed her eyes, accepting what was coming. But Jake's voice cut through her resignation. David, before you do something you can't take back, you should know something. David swung the gun toward him. What? Jake smiled grimly. I'm a forensic analyst, remember? First thing I did when I realized what was happening was set up surveillance. Motion-activated cameras, audio recording, direct feed to the cloud. Everything that's happened in this room for the past 10 minutes is already uploaded to 3 different servers. David's face went white. You're lying. Check the bookshelf behind you. Small black device next to the picture frame. There's another one on the mantel, and a third one in the kitchen. All recording, all uploading in real time. Margaret opened her eyes to see David spinning around, frantically searching. Sure enough, she could see the small devices Jake had. Mentioned when had he planted them. Even if you shoot us both right now, Jake continued, you're already on video threatening us with a gun, confessing to the harassment scheme, admitting you don't care about the people who died. The FBI will have this footage within minutes. David's breathing became rapid, panicked. The gun wavered in his grip. Game over, David, Jake said softly. The only choice you have left is whether you want to add murder to your charges. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then David's shoulders sagged and the gun clattered to the floor. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he whispered. It was just supposed to be business. Margaret walked over and picked up the gun, her hand steadier than she'd expected. Outside, she could hear sirens approaching. Jake must have triggered some kind of alert. Business, she repeated. Stanley Kowalski wasn't business, David. He was a human being. The police sirens were getting closer. David slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Aunt Margaret. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Margaret looked at her nephew, the boy she'd helped raise, the young man she'd been so proud of, the criminal she'd helped create. The sirens were right outside now. I know, she said sadly. Neither did I, but sorry doesn't bring back the dead. The front door burst open again, this time filled with police officers in tactical gear. As they swarmed into the room, Margaret caught Jake's eye. "Thank you," she mouthed. He nodded grimly. "It's not over yet." But as Margaret watched David being handcuffed and read his rights, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the possibility of redemption. Not forgiveness, she didn't deserve that. But maybe, if she was very lucky and worked very hard, she might eventually be able to live with what she'd done. The reckoning had begun. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the witness box of Federal District Court, her hands folded in her lap, facing a room full of strangers whose lives she had helped destroy. The prosecution had worked out a dealful cooperation in exchange for 5 years probation and community service. No prison time, but something far worse: having to look her victims in the eye. Mrs. Whitfield, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, said, "Please tell the court about your arrangement with Apex Properties." Margaret's voice was steady, rehearsed. She'd been preparing for this moment for months. "I would identify elderly residents who seemed vulnerably silated on fixed incomes, struggling with home maintenance. I would begin filing complaints against them with the city, noise violations, property code issues, sometimes completely fabricated charges. What was the purpose of these complaints? To create stress, to make them feel unwelcome in their own homes. When they became desperate enough to sell, my nephew David would arrange for Apex Properties to make immediate cash offers, always below market value. And you received compensation for this? Yes, usually between $1,000 and $3,000 per successful sale. Presented as gifts, but I knew what they really were. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of court reporters' pens. Margaret could feel eyes burning into her, from the gallery, some curious, some hateful, all judging. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you to look at the defendant's table. Do you identify David Whitfield as the person who coordinated this scheme?" Margaret turned to look at her nephew for the first time since his arrest. David had lost weight in jail, his face gaunt, his expensive suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Yes," she said, "that's David. And you're testifying today of your own free will." "Yes, even though Mr. Whitfield is your nephew." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "Yes, because what we did was wrong. And because Stanley Kowalski deserved justice." The defense attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Valdez, rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Whitfield, isn't it true that you're only testifying to save yourself from prison?" "Partly, yes." The honesty seemed to catch Valdez off guard. "I'm sorry," I said. "Partly, yes. I'm testifying to avoid prison. But I'm also testifying because 15 people lost their homes because of what I did, and one of them is dead." "But you're not taking responsibility for Mr. Kowalski's death, are you?" "You're blaming my client. I'm taking full responsibility," Margaret interrupted. "I killed Stanley Kowalski. Not directly, but I killed him. The stress, the harassment, the complaints that kept him awake at night, that was me. David coordinated it, but I was the weapon." Valdez paused, clearly not expecting this level of self-incrimination. "Mrs. Whitfield, you understand that admitting to causing Mr. Kowalski's death could expose you to additional charges." "I understand. I also understand that lying won't bring him back." The cross-examination continued for another hour, but Margaret's unflinching honesty seemed to deflate the defense's strategy. She admitted to everything: the money, the lies, the systematic targeting of vulnerable people. She didn't make excuses or shift blame. When court recessed for lunch, Margaret found herself alone in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was reaching for her phone when a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Whitfield." She turned to see an elderly Asian woman, probably in her 70s, walking toward her with the aid of a cane. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said, recognition flooding through her. I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to hear what you had to say." Mrs. Chen's voice was soft but steady. "About what you did to my family?" Margaret felt her composure cracking. Mrs. Chen had been one of her earliest victims, a widow who'd maintained beautiful bird feeders in her backyard until Margaret's relentless complaints had forced her to remove them. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry. Do you know what happened after I sold my house?" Margaret shook her head. "I moved to a senior apartment complex. No yard, no birds. I used to wake up every morning to the sound of cardinals and blue jays. Now I wake up to traffic noise and construction. Mrs. Chen's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I loved those birds. They were my companions after my husband died. Mrs. Chen, I'm not finished. The old woman's voice grew stronger. I came here today to tell you that I forgive you. Margaret stared at her, speechless. I'm 83 years old, Mrs. Chen continued. I don't have time to carry hate. But I wanted you to know what you took from me. Not just my house, my joy, my morning ritual, my connection to the world. I don't deserve your forgiveness. No, you don't. But I'm giving it anyway, because carrying this anger is killing me just like it killed Stanley. Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. This was my favorite bird, a cardinal that came to my feeder every morning for 3 years. I named him Henry, after my husband. Margaret looked at the photo through blurred vision. A brilliant red cardinal perched on a wooden feeder, its crest proud and alert. I want you to have this, Mrs. Chen said, pressing the photo into Margaret's hands. I want you to remember that when you destroyed my peace, you also destroyed Henry's home, and all the other birds who depended on me. Margaret clutched the photo, her body shaking with sobs. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I know you are. That's why I can forgive you. Mrs. Chen turned to leave, then paused. After Mrs. Chen left, Margaret sat on a bench in the hallway, staring at the photo of Henry the Cardinal. She thought about all the mornings she'd spent in her own backyard, listening to the birds, enjoying the peace. How had she become someone who would destroy that same peace for others? Jake Henderson found her there 20 minutes later. How are you holding up? He asked, sitting beside her. Mrs. Chen was here. She forgave me. Jake nodded. I know. I saw her in the gallery this morning. How can she forgive me? I destroyed her life, maybe because forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. Maybe it's about what she needs. Margaret looked at him. You still haven't told me why you helped me, why you didn't just let David shoot me and solve everyone's problems. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Because I used to be like you. What do you mean? Before I became a forensic analyst, I was a corporate lawyer, specialized in helping companies avoid responsibility for environmental damage. I was very good at it. He stared at his hands. There was a Kaisa chemical plant that was poisoning groundwater in a small town. I helped them delay cleanup for 7 years while they appealed and stalled and buried evidence. What happened? 18 people died, including a sick girl named Emma Rodriguez. Cancer caused by the contaminated water. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I had a daughter Emma's age. Same smile, same laugh. After Emma died, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at my own daughter without seeing that little girl's face. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. That's why you changed careers. That's why I changed everything. I quit corporate law, went back to school, became a forensic analyst, decided to spend the rest of my life helping solve crimes instead of helping people get away with them. But you could have let me face the consequences alone. You didn't have to help me. Jake looked at her directly. Because I know what it's like to carry that weight. To know that your actions killed innocent people. And I know that punishment isn't the same as justice. What do you mean? Punishment is about making you suffer for what you did. Justice is about making sure it never happens again. He gestured toward the courtroom. You testifying today. Helping convict David and shut down Apex Properties, that's justice. That's how you honor Stanley Kowalski's memory. A bailiff appeared in the hallway. Court is resuming in 5 minutes. As they walked back toward the courtroom, Margaret felt the photo of Henry the Cardinal in her pocket. Mrs. Chen's forgiveness, Jake's understanding, the chance to finally tell the truth, none of it erased what she'd done. But maybe, just maybe, it gave her a path forward. The afternoon session focused on the broader conspiracy how Apex Properties had operated across multiple states, targeting hundreds of elderly residents. Margaret's testimony provided crucial details about the recruitment process, the coordination between field operatives and the investment team, the systematic nature of the harassment campaigns. When court adjourned, David's attorney approached the prosecution table. My client wants to make a statement, Patricia Valdez said quietly. David stood up, his shackles rattling. For the first time all day, he looked directly at Margaret. Aunt Margaret, he said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I dragged you into this. I'm sorry I pointed a gun at you. I'm sorry about Stanley and Mrs. Chen and all the others. Tears ran down his face. "I'm sorry I became someone you couldn't be proud of." Margaret felt her heart breaking all over again. Despite everything, despite the crimes and the threats and the destruction, she still loved this broken man who had once been her little boy. "I'm sorry too, David," she said. "I'm sorry I taught you that rules were more important than people. I'm sorry I showed you how to justify cruelty. I'm sorry I failed you." The judge called for order, but the damage was done. In that moment of mutual recognition, both Margaret and Davy